She said the text meant nothing, so I agreed and told her that's exactly what our relationship meant too. Looking back, I should have trusted my instincts months earlier when the late nights and mysterious phone calls started becoming routine, but sometimes you want to believe in someone so badly that you ignore the evidence right in front of you until it becomes impossible to dismiss. I've always been the type of person who believes actions speak louder than words, which is probably why I noticed when Cora's phone buzzed on our kitchen counter that Tuesday morning and her whole demeanor changed so dramatically it was like watching someone flip a switch from comfortable intimacy to guilty panic in the span of a heartbeat. I wasn't trying to snoop or invade her privacy, but when someone's phone lights up with a message that starts with, "Last night was incredible, can't stop thinking about you," right next to where you're making your morning coffee before heading to work, it becomes pretty impossible not to see it, especially when the message is displayed in large enough font that you'd have to actively try not to read it. The sender's name was Wade, and I recognized it immediately because Cora had been mentioning him constantly over the past few months as the new head veterinarian at the animal hospital where she worked, always describing him as brilliant and sophisticated and worldly in ways that made me wonder why she felt the need to emphasize those particular qualities so often when talking about a colleague. I stood there for a long moment, steam rising from my mug while the Arizona morning sun streamed through our kitchen window and cast long shadows across the tile floor we'd installed together the previous summer, watching her scramble to flip the phone face down with this nervous laugh that didn't match the casual, comfortable morning routine we'd been sharing just seconds before everything changed. The whole scene felt surreal and disconnected, like one of those moments when you realize something fundamental has shifted in your life but your brain is still trying to process what exactly that means and how you're supposed to react to information that changes everything you thought you knew about your relationship. I'd been with Cora for 4 years, long enough to know her habits and moods and expressions, long enough to recognize when something was genuinely off versus when she was just having a bad day, and this felt like watching a dam develop its first hairline crack before the whole structure gives way and everything you've built gets swept downstream. I could have ignored it, could have pretended I hadn't seen anything, could have gone to work and spent the day convincing myself it was probably innocent or work-related or some kind of misunderstanding, but I'd spent too many years as a water treatment engineer to ignore obvious signs of system failure when they presented themselves so clearly and demanded immediate attention. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd built my career around detecting problems in municipal infrastructure before they became disasters that affected entire communities, yet I'd apparently missed the warning signs in my own relationship for months while they accumulated like pressure building behind a failing valve. I asked her directly what that message was about, keeping my voice level and calm the way I'd learned to do when dealing with municipal crisis situations at work. The kind of tone that doesn't escalate tensions but makes it clear you're expecting a straight answer rather than deflection or excuses. Her response was immediate and dismissive, telling me I was being completely dramatic over absolutely nothing and that whatever Wade had texted to her didn't mean anything at all, like I was some paranoid boyfriend freaking out over a colleague sending work-related messages at 7 in the morning about incredible veterinary procedures or something equally innocent. She said it with such casual indifference and barely concealed annoyance, like I was overreacting to a weather report or making a big deal out of someone saying hello in passing, and that's when something fundamental clicked into place for me about how little respect she had for my intelligence and how comfortable she'd become with lying to my face about things that mattered. I set my coffee mug down on the granite counter we'd picked out together when we'd moved into this townhouse 2 years ago during what I'd thought was a period of growing commitment and shared future planning, looked at her directly, and told her she was absolutely right about one thing. It didn't mean anything, just like our entire relationship apparently meant nothing either if she could dismiss my legitimate concerns so easily and expect me to accept obvious lies without question. The change in her expression was instantaneous and almost comical, going from irritated dismissal to something that looked like genuine panic as the reality of what I'd just said sank in and she realized I wasn't playing games or trying to start a fight but was completely serious about the implications of her response. I walked past her toward our shared bedroom, moving with the methodical efficiency I used when responding to emergency calls at the treatment plant, and I could hear her following behind me asking what I thought I was doing in this voice that was getting higher and more frantic with each word as the situation escalated beyond her ability to control it through dismissal and casual deflection. I told her exactly what it looked like I was doing, packing my things and leaving, because if 4 years of building a life together could be dismissed as meaningless drama over nothing, then there really wasn't much left to discuss or salvage, and I wasn't interested in being with someone who thought so little of me that she'd lie to my face about something this obvious. She kept talking, her voice escalating from confusion to desperation as I continued methodically pulling clothes from our shared dresser and folding them into the duffel bag I'd used for camping trips back when we used to do things together, but I'd already made my decision the moment she'd chosen to minimize and dismiss rather than explain or apologize or show any respect for my feelings or intelligence. I'd learned long ago, both through work experience and life experience, that when someone shows you who they are through their actions and then confirms it with their words and attitude, the smartest and most self-respecting thing you can do is believe them both times and act accordingly rather than waste time hoping they'll suddenly become someone different. What made the whole situation even more bitter was remembering how much I'd sacrificed to support what I'd thought were our shared dreams and her veterinary career aspirations over the years we'd been together. 4 years ago, when we'd first started dating, I'd been living in Phoenix and working for a private environmental consulting firm that specialized in industrial water treatment systems, making decent money and genuinely enjoying the technical challenges that came with designing filtration systems for manufacturing plants across the Southwest. When Cora got accepted into the specialized animal hospital program here in Tucson, I didn't hesitate to relocate my entire life to support her opportunity, even though it meant leaving behind a job I loved and starting over in a new city where I had no professional connections or established reputation in the field I'd spent years building expertise in through night classes and certification programs. I'd found work with the municipal water treatment facility, which paid less initially but offered better long-term stability, and I'd convinced myself that supporting her goals was more important than my immediate career advancement since we were supposedly building something together for the future and both our careers would eventually benefit from the temporary sacrifice I was making for the relationship. 6 months later, when she landed an internship at the prestigious veterinary hospital downtown that required her to work irregular hours and weekends, I'd passed up a lucrative position with the city's water department that would have meant regular travel and overtime pay because she'd said she needed me to be available and flexible to support her demanding schedule and the emotional stress of learning advanced veterinary procedures under high-pressure conditions with difficult supervisors and complex cases. I'd told myself it was temporary, that once she finished her internship and settled into her career, we'd be able to focus on advancing mine. But that conversation never seemed to come up naturally, and I'd gradually stopped bringing it up because she always seemed stressed about her own professional challenges and I didn't want to add pressure to what she described as an already overwhelming situation that required all her mental energy and focus. When she decided to pursue advanced certification courses in exotic animal medicine, courses that cost nearly $8,000 and weren't covered by the hospital's continuing education budget, I'd used most of my savings to help fund her education because she'd convinced me it was an investment in our future together and would open doors to higher-paying positions that would benefit both of us eventually when she established herself as a specialist in her field with credentials that few other veterinarians in the region possessed. I'd been proud to support her ambitions, proud to be with someone so driven and focused on helping animals, and I genuinely believed we were building towards something meaningful together where both our careers would eventually flourish and complement each other in ways that would justify all the sacrifices I'd made along the way and create the kind of stable, prosperous life we talked about during those late-night conversations about our dreams and goals. Looking back now, I could see how naive I'd been about the one-sided nature of our relationship dynamics, how I'd consistently been the one making sacrifices and adjustments while she'd simply accepted my support as something she deserved rather than something she appreciated or planned to reciprocate when circumstances allowed for it and her career was more established and financially secure. The signs had been there for months, subtle at first but growing more obvious as time went on, though I'd been too invested in the relationship to recognize them for what they were or to acknowledge that my gut instincts had been trying to warn me about changes in her behavior and priorities that suggested she was becoming a different person than the one I'd fallen in love with. She'd started attending what she called professional development seminars almost every weekend, events that supposedly focused on advanced veterinary techniques and industry networking opportunities, always returning home late with expensive wine on her breath and stories about presentations and workshops that sounded vague and generic when I asked for specific details about what she'd learned or who she'd met or what connections she'd made that might benefit her career advancement. The emergency surgeries had become increasingly frequent too, always seeming to happen on evenings when we'd made plans together, forcing last-minute cancellations of dinners or movies or weekend trips we'd been looking forward to. And she'd always apologize profusely while explaining how unpredictable her field could be and how she couldn't control when animals needed immediate medical attention that only she could provide due to her specialized training and expertise. What had really started to bother me, though, were the expensive new items that kept appearing in her wardrobe and jewelry collection. Designer pieces she'd claim were gifts from grateful pet owners whose animals she'd saved through her exceptional care and expertise in ways that apparently warranted extravagant personal gifts rather than just professional recommendations or referrals to other pet owners who might need similar services. A silk scarf from the owner of a Persian cat she'd treated for kidney disease, diamond earrings from someone whose German Shepherd had needed emergency surgery, a leather handbag worth more than my monthly car payment from a client whose prize-winning horse had recovered from a serious illness thanks to her intervention and round-the-clock monitoring during a critical recovery period. I'd wanted to believe her explanations because they spoke to her skill and dedication as a veterinarian, but something about the frequency and value of these gifts had started to feel implausible, especially when I'd never heard of any of my colleagues in municipal engineering receiving expensive personal gifts from grateful communities whose water systems they'd improved or maintained or whose environmental problems they'd solved through innovative treatment solutions. The late-night phone calls had been another growing concern, calls that would come in after 10 or 11 at night and send her stepping out onto our back patio to talk privately about what she always described as urgent consultations with other veterinary professionals or discussions with specialists about complex cases she was handling that required immediate input from experts in different subspecialties of veterinary medicine. Once I'd finished packing and was clearly serious about leaving, Cora's defensive posture crumbled completely and she finally admitted to what I'd already figured out from that morning's text message and months of increasingly obvious lies and suspicious behavior that I'd been too trusting to confront directly. She confessed to having been involved in a months-long affair with Wade, the hospital's new head veterinarian, but instead of showing any genuine remorse or acknowledgement of the pain she'd caused me and the trust she'd violated through her deception and betrayal, she immediately launched into a series of elaborate justifications and rationalizations that made it absolutely clear she saw herself as the victim in this situation rather than the person who'd betrayed 4 years of trust and commitment without a second thought about the consequences. According to her completely twisted logic and self-serving interpretation of events, the affair was somehow entirely my fault because I lacked the ambition and professional drive that someone of her exceptional caliber and unlimited potential deserved in a romantic partner, and Wade represented everything I apparently wasn't sophisticated or worldly or successful enough to be for someone with her refined tastes and impossibly high standards for what constituted real success and social status in. She described Wade as cultured and intellectually stimulating, someone who understood the pressures and complexities of her demanding veterinary career in ways that a simple municipal employee like me never could or would be able to comprehend, and she made it sound like their relationship was some kind of profound intellectual and professional meeting of minds rather than a basic betrayal of trust and commitment that had been going on behind my back for months while I continued to support her, financially and emotionally. When I pointed out that I'd spent the better part of 4 years financially and emotionally supporting her career aspirations without complaint, relocating my entire life and sacrificing my own professional advancement opportunities to help her achieve her goals and build the prestigious veterinary career she'd always claimed to want more than anything else in the world, she dismissed those contributions as completely irrelevant and suggested that my steady but unexciting job was boring and predictable compared to Wade's dynamic leadership role and his extensive connections throughout the regional veterinary community that could actually advance her career in meaningful and lucrative ways. She told me with increasing arrogance that Wade offered excitement and professional networking opportunities that she deserved as someone with her potential and ambitions, Opportunities that apparently included expensive dinners at restaurants I couldn't afford on my municipal salary and weekend getaways to veterinary conferences and professional events in places like San Francisco and Denver that would enhance her image and social status within the veterinary profession in ways that my modest support and encouragement never could have accomplished. Her tone became increasingly condescending and cruel as she continued her explanation, suggesting that I should actually be grateful she'd stayed with me as long as she had, considering how little I had to offer someone of her caliber and potential for greatness in her chosen field, as if our entire relationship had been some kind of charitable act on her part rather than a genuine partnership between two people who supposedly loved and supported each other through life's challenges. She painted herself as someone who'd been settling for mediocrity and small-town thinking out of some misguided sense of loyalty or perhaps pity for my limited circumstances, when what she really needed and deserved was a partner who could match her sophistication and ambition, someone who moved in the same elevated professional circles and understood what it meant to pursue excellence and recognition rather than just contentment and stability and the simple pleasures that apparently marked me as hopelessly provincial and unsophisticated. The way she spoke about Wade with such reverence and admiration made it sound like he was some kind of savior who'd rescued her from the mundane existence she'd been trapped in with me, and she described their time together as intellectually stimulating and professionally enriching in ways that our relationship had never been able to provide for her despite all the support and encouragement I'd given her over the years we'd been together. She claimed that Wade challenged her to think bigger and reach higher in her career aspirations, while I'd apparently been holding her back by being satisfied with our quiet domestic life and my steady but unremarkable career trajectory that would never lead to the kind of prestige and recognition she craved and felt she deserved based on her education and natural talents. What really stung and revealed the depth of her contempt for me was her characterization of me as a blue-collar nobody who couldn't appreciate fine dining or cultural events, as if my work in municipal water treatment was somehow less valuable or important to society than her veterinary practice or Wade's administrative position, and as if my practical approach to life and finances was some kind of character flaw rather than responsible adult behavior that had enabled me to support her financially for years while she built her career. She made it sound like I was intellectually inferior and culturally unsophisticated because I preferred staying home and cooking dinner together rather than spending hundreds of dollars at trendy restaurants where the portions were tiny and the atmosphere was pretentious and designed more for showing off than actual enjoyment, or because I'd rather spend weekends hiking in the desert or working on home improvement projects than attending expensive cultural events that served more as social networking opportunities than genuine entertainment or education. According to her completely warped perspective and sense of entitlement, my contentment with our life together was actually a sign of limited vision and lack of ambition that had been dragging her down, while her constant desire for more expensive experiences and higher social status was evidence of her sophisticated taste and drive for excellence that I was simply too pedestrian and small-minded to understand or appreciate properly given my working-class background and modest expectations for. The most insulting part of her entire tirade was her suggestion that I should be thanking her for the years we'd spent together rather than feeling betrayed by her affair and systematic deception, as if she'd been doing me some kind of enormous favor by allowing me to support her financially and emotionally while she pursued her career goals and apparently evaluated other romantic options on the side without my knowledge or consent. She acted like our entire relationship had been an act of charity on her part, a generous gesture towards someone who was clearly beneath her in terms of social class and professional status, and that I should recognize how lucky I'd been to have access to someone of her beauty and intelligence for as long as I had before she inevitably moved on to someone more appropriate for her elevated station in life and career aspirations. When I remained completely unmoved by her explanations and continued packing my belongings with the same methodical efficiency I'd used to solve a complex problem at the water treatment plant, she became even more desperate and cruel in her attacks, telling me that Wade had already proven himself to be a better partner in just a few months than I'd been in 4 years of relationship, and that she'd finally found someone who could give her the kind of sophisticated lifestyle she'd always deserved, but had been too kind-hearted and patient to demand from me during our time together. She claimed that Wade appreciated her intellect and ambitions in ways I never had, that he recognized her potential and supported her career goals with actual resources and professional connections rather than just emotional encouragement and financial assistance that came from my limited income and modest lifestyle that would never be able to provide the kind of opportunities she needed to reach her full potential in the veterinary field. The final insult came when she suggested with obvious satisfaction that perhaps this painful breakup was actually the best thing that could happen to both of us in the long run, since I could find someone more suited to my simple needs and limited aspirations while she could finally be with someone who matched her level of sophistication and professional success, someone who could provide the kind of partnership that would help her achieve the recognition and status she'd always known she was destined for in her career and in life generally. She made it sound like she was doing me a tremendous favor by leaving and being honest about her affair, freeing me from the burden of trying to keep up with someone so far above my league, and that I should appreciate her brutal honesty about what she really needed in a partner rather than being angry about the underhanded way she'd gone about finding it behind my back while continuing to accept my financial and emotional support. Throughout this entire painful confrontation, I continued packing my belongings with mechanical precision while Cora alternated between cruel justifications for her behavior and increasingly desperate pleas as the reality of my departure began to sink in and she realized I wasn't going to be manipulated into staying or convinced to give her another chance. She followed me from room to room in our shared townhouse like a persistent shadow, watching with growing panic and disbelief as I methodically loaded my pickup truck with my tools, camping gear, and personal items that represented 4 years of building what I'd thought was a shared life together but now understood had been nothing more than a convenient arrangement for her. The camping equipment felt particularly symbolic as I carried my sleeping bag and hiking boots to the truck. Remembering all the weekend trips we'd taken together in the early days of our relationship when she'd seemed genuinely interested in the outdoor activities I loved and had claimed to enjoy sharing those experiences with me before her priorities shifted toward more sophisticated pursuits and expensive social events that apparently better matched her elevated sense of self-worth and social status. My toolbox was heavy as I carried it down the front steps, filled with the specialized equipment I'd accumulated over the years for home improvement projects that I'd naively believed were investments in our future together, and I could see Cora standing in the doorway watching me load it into the truck bed with an expression of growing desperation and calculation on her face as if she was trying to figure out exactly what she could say or do to prevent this from happening. Her earlier arrogance and condescending attitude began to crumble visibly as she watched me pack systematically and efficiently, as if she'd expected me to break down and beg her to reconsider her affair or at least engage in some kind of dramatic argument that might give her leverage to manipulate the situation back in her favor and maintain some control over the narrative of our breakup. Instead, I maintained the same calm, methodical approach I'd used to troubleshoot a complex system failure at the water treatment plant, focusing entirely on the practical task at hand while she continued her stream of alternating justifications and increasingly frantic attempts to minimize what she'd done and convince me to stay and work things out like mature adults who could overcome this temporary setback. She kept insisting that the affair with Wade didn't really mean anything significant in the larger context of our relationship, that it was just a temporary mistake brought on by stress and confusion about her career goals and professional obligations, and that we could definitely get past this if I was willing to be understanding about the pressures she'd been under lately with her demanding job and the complicated dynamics at the veterinary hospital. The irony of her calling it meaningless wasn't lost on me, considering how she'd started this entire conversation by dismissing my legitimate concerns as drama over nothing, and I found a certain grim satisfaction in watching her scramble to redefine the situation and minimize its importance now that she was faced with real consequences for her choices and betrayal. As I continued loading my belongings into the truck bed and back seat, she became increasingly desperate and began making elaborate promises about how things would be completely different if I stayed, how she'd cut off all contact with Wade immediately and focus entirely on rebuilding our relationship and proving that I was the one she really wanted to be with for the long term despite her recent poor judgment. She promised she'd quit attending those professional development seminars that had been taking up her weekends and providing cover for her affair, that she'd be more attentive to my needs and interests instead of focusing so obsessively on her career advancement, that she'd even consider moving to a different city if that's what it took to make a fresh start together somewhere away from all the professional complications and temptations that had led her astray from our relationship. Her voice took on an increasingly frantic and high-pitched quality as she watched me carry box after box of my possessions to the truck, and I could see her mentally calculating how much longer the packing process would take and whether she had enough time left to find the right combination of words and promises that might convince me to change my mind about leaving and give her another opportunity to prove herself. She kept reaching out to touch my arm or shoulder as I walked past her carrying my belongings, trying to make physical contact that might slow down my methodical progress or force me to engage with her emotionally rather than continuing with the practical task of removing myself from the situation and the toxic dynamic she'd created through her deception. When her pleas and promises failed to get any meaningful response from me other than continued packing and loading, she shifted tactics completely and began trying to engage me in detailed conversations about practical matters related to our shared life. Asking pointed questions about the lease on the townhouse and how we'd divide the utility bills and what would happen to the shared checking account we'd set up to handle household expenses and joint purchases. I could tell she was hoping that discussing these logistical complications might make me realize how difficult and messy it would be to actually end our relationship completely, and that maybe the prospect of dealing with all these tedious practical details would convince me to reconsider and try to work things out instead of forcing us both to deal with the significant hassle of completely separating our intertwined lives and financial obligations. But her attempts to engage me in discussions about shared financial responsibilities and practical arrangements only reinforced my determination to leave as quickly as possible, since it reminded me how much of my income had been going towards supporting her lifestyle and career ambitions while she was apparently using that financial stability as a foundation to explore other romantic options without my knowledge or consent. As I loaded the last of my clothes into garbage bags and cardboard boxes I'd found in our storage closet, Cora's demeanor shifted again toward desperate anger and frustration, and she began accusing me of being unreasonable and overly dramatic for throwing away 4 years over what she characterized as a relatively minor mistake that could be forgiven and forgotten if I was mature enough to handle adult relationship complications and imperfections. She claimed I was being stubborn and prideful rather than showing the kind of understanding and forgiveness that real love requires when couples face challenges, and she suggested that my inability to work through this crisis together proved that I wasn't as genuinely committed to our relationship as I'd always claimed to be when we talked about our future plans and long-term goals. The manipulation was transparent and pathetic, but it also revealed how little she actually understood about respect and trust in relationships, since she seemed to genuinely believe that betraying someone for months while accepting their financial and emotional support was somehow equivalent to a minor disagreement that could be resolved through compromise and mature communication rather than the fundamental violation of trust that it actually represented. When I finally closed the tailgate of my truck and walked around to the driver's door, Cora's composure completely collapsed and she ran out onto the front lawn in her bare feet, sobbing and shouting apologies while our neighbors began peering through their curtains at the spectacle she was creating. She stood there in the morning sunlight looking desperate and pathetic, her hair disheveled and her face streaked with tears, calling my name and begging me to come back inside so we could talk about this rationally like adults who still loved each other despite this temporary setback in our relationship. I moved into a small rental house near the water treatment facility within a week, a modest 2-bedroom place with a decent yard that felt like a sanctuary compared to the tension and deception that had filled our shared townhouse during those final months of our relationship when every conversation had become a potential minefield of lies and manipulation. The house was nothing special by most standards, but it was mine alone, and there was something profoundly liberating about being able to come home to a space where I didn't have to wonder who Cora was texting or where she'd really been during those mysterious professional development seminars that had apparently been elaborate cover stories for her ongoing affair with Wade and his expensive entertainment budget. I threw myself into my work with renewed focus and energy that surprised even my longtime colleagues, taking on overtime shifts and pursuing additional certifications in environmental engineering that I'd been putting off for years while prioritizing Cora's career advancement and professional development over my own goals and aspirations. My supervisors at the treatment plant quickly noticed my increased dedication and the innovative quality improvements I was implementing in our filtration systems, And within 3 months I'd been promoted to senior technician with a substantial raise that more than compensated for the financial strain of maintaining 2 separate households during the difficult transition period following our breakup. The extra money felt like vindication for all those years I'd spent supporting Cora's expensive tastes and career ambitions while sacrificing my own professional advancement. And I finally had the financial resources and mental energy to pursue my own interests and goals without having to constantly calculate whether I could afford to help fund someone else's lifestyle choices and professional networking expenses at trendy restaurants and conferences. I started rock climbing at a local gym, something I'd always wanted to try but had never pursued because Cora had consistently dismissed it as dangerous and pointless, preferring indoor activities that didn't interfere with her carefully maintained appearance or require her to risk breaking a nail or messing up her hair before important social and professional events. The physical challenge and mental focus required for climbing provided exactly the kind of stress relief and personal accomplishment I needed during this period of rebuilding my life. And I found myself looking forward to those evening sessions where I could work out the lingering frustration and anger that still occasionally surfaced when I thought about how thoroughly I'd been deceived and manipulated during what I'd thought were the stable final months of our relationship. I also joined a photography club that met on weekends, finally having the time and mental energy to pursue creative interests that I'd neglected while devoting so much of my attention to supporting Cora's career goals and managing all the logistics of our shared life together, from household expenses to social obligations that always seemed to revolve around her professional network and advancement opportunities. The photography club organized regular weekend trips to document Arizona's stunning desert landscapes, and I discovered a genuine passion for capturing the subtle beauty and dramatic lighting of the Sonoran Desert through my camera lens. Finding peace and perspective in the vastness and silence of places like Saguaro National Park and the Superstition Mountains that were far removed from the petty drama and professional politics that had consumed so much of Cora's attention and energy during our relationship. These weekend excursions became a form of meditation for me, allowing me to process the emotional aftermath of our breakup while developing a new skill that brought me genuine satisfaction and connected me with a group of people who shared similar interests in outdoor exploration and artistic expression rather than career networking and social climbing. Meanwhile, the consequences of Cora's affair began catching up to her in ways that provided a certain satisfying sense of cosmic justice, though I learned about most of these developments through mutual friends and colleagues rather than any direct contact with her, since I'd made a clean break and had no interest in maintaining any connection to the drama she'd created for herself. Wade's wife had discovered their relationship through credit card receipts from expensive restaurants where he'd been taking Cora during their supposed professional meetings and development sessions. And the resulting confrontation had led to not only immediate divorce proceedings but also Wade's swift firing from the veterinary hospital when the board of directors learned about his inappropriate relationship with a subordinate staff member and the potential legal liability it created for the organization. The hospital's administration took an extremely dim view of senior staff members who used their positions of authority to pursue romantic affairs with younger colleagues, especially when those relationships involved the kind of expensive entertainment and gift-giving that suggested possible misuse of hospital resources or vendor relationships that could create serious conflicts of interest and expose the organization to accusations of favoritism and financial impropriety. Cora faced her own significant professional consequences when the hospital board conducted their thorough investigation into Wade's conduct and discovered the full extent of their relationship, including the expensive dinners and weekend trips that had been funded through his departmental budget, resulting in a formal reprimand that was placed in her permanent personnel file and effectively eliminated any possibility of advancement opportunities within the organization for the foreseeable future. The veterinary community in Tucson was relatively small and tightly connected through professional associations and referral networks, which meant that word of the scandal spread quickly throughout the local professional community, making it extremely difficult for Cora to pursue opportunities at other practices without having to explain the embarrassing circumstances that had led to her professional difficulties and damaged reputation at the hospital. Her carefully cultivated dreams of building a prestigious career in exotic animal medicine were effectively shattered, and she found herself stuck in a dead-end position with a permanently damaged professional reputation that would follow her for years throughout the regional veterinary community. all for the sake of an affair with a man who had used his position and expense account to impress her before ultimately abandoning her when the situation became professionally inconvenient and legally risky for him. The expensive gifts and restaurant dinners that had seemed so sophisticated and romantic when Wade was paying for them with hospital funds and departmental budgets turned out to be nothing more than a manipulative seduction strategy that he'd apparently used with other female colleagues in previous positions at different organizations, and Cora had been naive enough to believe she was special and uniquely deserving rather than just his latest target of opportunity in what was clearly a pattern of unethical behavior. I learned from a colleague who worked at the hospital that Cora had tried desperately to maintain contact with Wade after his firing and the explosive dissolution of his marriage, but he'd blocked her number and refused to respond to any of her messages once it became clear that their relationship had cost him his marriage, his job, and his professional reputation in the Tucson veterinary community where he'd spent years building his career. The man who had promised to help advance her career and provide the sophisticated lifestyle she felt she deserved had vanished from her life as quickly as he'd entered it, leaving her to deal with all the professional and personal consequences of their affair entirely on her own while he presumably moved on to start over somewhere else where his reputation hadn't been completely destroyed by his poor judgment and unethical behavior with subordinate colleagues. 6 months later, as I was settling into my new routine and genuinely enjoying the peace and independence of my rebuilt life, Cora began a sustained campaign of increasingly desperate contact attempts as her own life continued to unravel dramatically in the aftermath of her affair and its devastating professional consequences that had destroyed her career prospects in the local veterinary community. She lost her apartment when she couldn't afford the rent without my substantial financial contribution, a harsh reality check that apparently came as a genuine shock to someone who'd grown so accustomed to living well beyond her means with my support subsidizing her expensive lifestyle choices, designer purchases, and career-focused spending habits that she'd somehow forgotten how much her standard of living depended on my income. She was forced to move back in with her parents in their modest house on the outskirts of Tucson, a deeply humiliating step backward that must have been particularly galling for someone who'd spent years looking down on my supposedly limited ambitions and pedestrian lifestyle choices, and who'd made such a point of emphasizing her sophisticated tastes and elevated social status during our final confrontation about her affair. Her attempts to find employment at other veterinary practices throughout the region were repeatedly unsuccessful due to the persistent professional gossip that had spread like wildfire throughout the tight-knit Tucson veterinary community, where word of her affair with Wade and the circumstances surrounding his firing had made her a significant liability that most practice owners were reluctant to take on given the potential for workplace drama, unprofessional behavior, and the kind of scandal that could damage their own reputations and client relationships. Her desperate contact attempts ranged from the pathetic to the genuinely manipulative, starting with fake emergency calls claiming that our shared cat was dying and needed immediate medical attention, despite the obvious fact that we'd never owned a cat together during our entire 4-year relationship, a glaring detail that apparently escaped her notice in her panic to find any plausible excuse to get me to respond to her messages and reopen communication between us. When the fake pet emergency failed to generate the sympathetic response she wanted, she escalated her efforts to showing up at my workplace during shift changes, apparently hoping to catch me in public where social pressure and professional embarrassment might force me to at least acknowledge her presence and listen to whatever sob story she'd prepared to try to win back my sympathy and financial support. The security guards at the water treatment facility had to escort her away multiple times after she began lurking in the employee parking lot and approaching my coworkers with urgent requests to deliver messages to me. Behavior that was not only deeply embarrassing for her but also created an uncomfortable and potentially hostile work environment for my colleagues who were trying to maintain professional boundaries while dealing with what was obviously a messy personal drama they wanted absolutely no part of. Her family members began calling me as well, with Cora's mother leaving increasingly aggressive and accusatory voicemails blaming me for abandoning someone who desperately needed support during what she characterized as a difficult transition period, as if I bore some moral and financial responsibility for helping Cora deal with the natural consequences of her own deliberate choices and systematic betrayals of our relationship. The breathtaking irony of her mother's accusations wasn't lost on me, Considering that she was essentially demanding that I continue providing emotional and presumably financial support for someone who had systematically betrayed my trust while accepting my help for years. And I found it particularly telling that the focus was entirely on what I supposedly owed Cora rather than any acknowledgement of what she'd done to destroy our relationship through her deception and affair. These well-meaning family interventions revealed how little Cora had apparently told her parents about the real circumstances of our breakup, since her mother seemed genuinely surprised and taken aback when I briefly but clearly explained that Cora had been conducting a months-long affair while I was supporting her career and lifestyle, information that was apparently completely new to someone who'd been led to believe that I'd simply abandoned her daughter for no good reason during a challenging period in her professional development. The phone calls from family members stopped abruptly after that enlightening conversation, suggesting that Cora's carefully crafted version of events hadn't included the inconvenient details about her affair with a married supervisor and the serious professional consequences that had resulted from her poor judgment and unethical behavior that had violated workplace policies and professional standards. Meanwhile, I was building something genuinely positive and fulfilling in my own life, developing new friendships through the photography club and rock climbing gym that were based on shared interests and mutual respect rather than financial dependency and emotional manipulation. Relationships that felt healthier and more authentic than anything I'd experienced during the final years of my relationship with Cora, when every interaction had been filtered through her needs and ambitions rather than any genuine partnership or mutual support between equals. The final confrontation came 8 months after our breakup at my coworker Miguel's housewarming party, an event I'd been looking forward to as a chance to socialize with colleagues and continue building the healthy social connections that had become such an important part of my rebuilt life. I was talking with Isabel, a fellow photographer from my club whom I'd been dating casually for about 2 months, when I saw Cora appear in the doorway looking disheveled and desperate, clearly uninvited but somehow having learned about the party and decided to crash it in another attempt to force a conversation between us. She looked terrible, like someone who'd been sleeping poorly and stress-eating, her once carefully maintained appearance replaced by the hollow-eyed look of someone whose life had completely fallen apart and who was grasping at increasingly desperate measures to try to regain some control over her circumstances. I watched her scan the room until she spotted me across the crowded living room, and I could see her gathering her courage before making her way through the party guests toward where Isabel and I were standing near the kitchen, clearly prepared for some kind of dramatic confrontation that she'd probably been rehearsing during the drive over to Miguel's house. When she reached us, she ignored Isabel completely and launched into a rambling speech about how sorry she was and how much she'd learned about herself and what really mattered during the months since our relationship had ended, claiming that losing me had been the wake-up call she needed to reassess her priorities and recognize what she'd thrown away through her poor judgment and selfish behavior. She told me she'd been working at an animal shelter for minimum wage since being effectively blacklisted from the veterinary practices in the area, a humbling experience that had supposedly taught her the value of honest work and simple living rather than the materialistic pursuits and social climbing that had led her astray during our relationship. She mentioned that she was living in her childhood bedroom at her parents' house, sleeping in the same twin bed she'd used in high school, surrounded by posters and decorations from her teenage years, a living reminder of how far she'd fallen from the sophisticated lifestyle she'd thought she deserved when she'd chosen Wade over the stable relationship we'd built together. Meanwhile, she informed me with obvious bitterness, Wade had moved to California for what he described as a fresh start, leaving behind the wreckage of his marriage and career to reinvent himself somewhere his reputation hadn't been destroyed by his unethical behavior and poor judgment with subordinate colleagues. She painted a picture of complete abandonment and betrayal, describing how Wade had cut off all contact the moment his situation became legally complicated and professionally untenable, revealing his promises of career advancement and sophisticated lifestyle to be nothing more than manipulation tactics designed to get what he wanted without any genuine commitment to her well-being or future. As she continued her desperate plea for another chance, I found myself using her own words against her in a way that felt both satisfying and definitively final, telling her calmly that she was being dramatic over nothing since our breakup had meant zero, just like our relationship apparently had according to her own assessment that morning 8 months ago when this all began. Her face crumpled as she realized I was throwing her dismissive words back at her, and I could see the recognition in her eyes that this wasn't going to end the way she'd hoped, that there would be no tearful reconciliation or second chance to prove she'd learned from her mistakes and was worthy of forgiveness. My calm indifference contrasted sharply with her increasingly frantic attempts to explain how she'd changed and grown during our time apart, and I realized as I watched her public breakdown in Miguel's living room that I felt nothing but relief that this chapter of my life was permanently closed and that I'd never have to deal with her manipulation and drama again. Isabel stood beside me throughout this uncomfortable scene, her presence serving as a quiet reminder of the healthy relationship I was building with someone who actually respected me and shared my values, someone who'd never dream of betraying my trust or dismissing my concerns as meaningless drama the way Cora had done that morning when she destroyed everything we'd supposedly built together. When Miguel and his girlfriend finally asked Cora to leave, citing the disruption she was causing to their celebration, she made one last desperate attempt to get my attention by shouting my name across the room, but I'd already turned away and was walking toward the back patio with Isabel, ready to continue enjoying the evening with people who actually wanted me in their lives rather than someone who'd only realized my value after losing the financial and emotional support I'd provided for years without appreciation or respect.